Hey everyone, for those of you who don't know me, I am Dr. Lisa Oliver and I am a life transition educator and certified grief counselor. And this is Dr. Lisa Talks About. So in this installment, I'm going to talk about complicated grief. And essentially, I'm just really providing an overview because there is a whole industry. Columbia University has a whole building dedicated to the study of complicated grief. So my purpose here is to make you aware of it. And, if you're interested, you can, do some Google searches or go to speak to someone if you think you have complicated grief. So let's start, okay? Let me share my screen. Okay, so this is Dr. Lisa Talks About Complicated Grief. And so here's our agenda. I'm going to first have a disclosure because, we always need to protect ourselves against those who think that I may be delivering or trying to deliver something that I'm really not trying to. So I need to do a disclosure. I'm going to talk to you about the situation, give a definition of grief with the illustration, followed up with the definition of complicated grief with the illustration. And I'm going to talk about what could cause an individual to experience complicated grief. And I'm really talking about this from a social perspective versus a medical or a psychological perspective, okay? And I'm going to also hand you some resources on grief. So here's the disclosure. I am not a therapist or a physician. I am an educator, and I educate people on life transitions, essentially death, dying, and bereavement. So I am doing this presentation to make you aware of one of the many types of grief that is out there. My idea is that if I can make you aware of something, that's just more education that you have, that you can run with it and find out everything about it. But a lot of times there's some things that we just don't even know, right? So I'm here to give you an awareness of complicated grief. Again, the purpose of this presentation is to provide an educational overview on a topic. This is not the end all be all, and I'm really just not even scratching the surface, just giving you an overview. And this information is not to be used to determine a diagnosis. Again, I am not a physician and I am not a therapist. I am a grief counselor and an educator. So here's the situation. So I was talking to someone, emailing, and this is what they told me. The situation. Since my father died about 10 years ago, my mother makes life difficult for everyone. While I understand she may still be grieving him, I am still grieving him too. I did as much as I could for my father when he was here. Ruining the rest of my life is not a great way to honor him. So the bottom line is this individual mother seems as though that ever since the father died, she has just not recovered. And in her not recovering, she's just making life miserable for everyone. So let's talk about what grief is. The bottom line, grief is the response to something, grief is the response to the loss of something meaningful. Now, and a lot of times we associate grief with the death of either a loved one or a pet. But the truth is that in every change that we have in life, we grieve it. Whether we lost a job, we grieve that. If we lose a relationship, we'll grieve that. But another thing, something that we look forward to, for example, most of us look forward to retirement. Well, retirement is the end of having to punch a clock and be somewhere at a certain time. But in retirement, there is no structure. You don't have your work friends or your work husband or work wife, right? So, and also there may be the amount of money that you made when you were working is not the same amount. So we grieve these things. We grieve anything, anytime it's a change or it's a loss, right? We have grief. And the bottom line is it's the response to a loss of something meaningful. Now, the more intricate, as I could say, definition of grief from the Columbia Center for Complicated Grief is grief is the response to loss that contains thoughts, behaviors, emotions, and physiological changes. If the loss is permanent, so too is the grief, but its form evolves and changes as a person adapts to loss. So this is saying, and I've always said this, is that, grief will never go away, but will not be as intense as the moment that you first found out that person died, right? So a couple of things about grief. Everyone grief is their own. You could be part of a set of twins, and if a parent dies, even twins, everyone grieves different. So a mother's grief is going to be different than, a person's grief as the wife is going to be different than an individual's grief as the child. Everyone grieves different, so you cannot compare what someone is going through and what you're going through. Love is not a love is not an indication of grief, or the amount of grief that someone has, or if they keep on grieving doesn't mean they love them anymore, any less. Again, everyone's experience is different. And like I said earlier, there is no timeline to when grief will end. It ends when you die, right? So the thing about grief is that in normal, and when I say normal, when the medical or the psychological society, they look at what normal or typical grief is very intense in the beginning, but after about a year, 13 months, it kind of tapers off. So here's my little illustration. So what we have here is that you see we have on the left side of the timeline at the time one learns about the death, and approximately 1 year after. And I say approximately because, again, everybody's situation is different. So you have your emotional highs and your emotional lows. And again, this is for illustration purposes only. So if you think about when a person first learns that someone has died, right? So the emotions are low. It might level out a little bit, but it's low, and maybe it's kind of happy. It's like you think about, and the reason why I made that, in this part right here, happy, is because if you think about it, when we all get together and have a funeral and a repast, there's a lot of fun times. We have family and we have a lot of memories and stuff. So that's where I put that high emotion. So this is about, the one from the moment of to maybe 4 months later. That's where the emotions are. Then the second part of like the next 3 or 4, 6 months, you see people are kind of sad, but it's a little bit more up and down, right? You're still going to have memories. Things are going to happen, and you're going to immediately remember that person has died, and you're going to get sad. I think I've told y'all before, my mother's been dead over 22 years, and there is still something that I could think about or smell, and it just brings me down. But I don't stay down as long as I did when she first died, right? So as the person is deceased longer, it will not be as intense, and you'll have more space between the times that you have your ups and downs. So again, we're going towards approximately 1 year after 1 year after the death. You see on the left hand side, everything was just an emotional low, and then when you get to 1 year after the death, it's more like an up down, up down. Like I said, you'll never get over it. There's always going to be things that trigger you, but it will not be as intense. This is if you are experiencing normal, typical grief. So let's talk about complicated grief. So this is my definition. Complicated grief is when the individual's grief is just as intense 1 year later as the moment the individual learned their loved one has died. It is not exactly as intense, but there's nowhere near this leveling out. It's the same things that are happening, and the person just cannot let go and even try to move on. So I'm going to give you the Columbia Center for Complicated Grief's definition of complicated grief. Complicated grief is a persistent form of intense grief in which maladaptive thoughts, maladaptive means they have not adapted. Complicated grief is a persistent form of intense grief in which maladaptive thoughts and dysfunctional behaviors are present, along with continued yearning, longing, and sadness, and or preoccupation with thoughts and memories of the person who died. Grief continues to dominate life, and the future seems bleak and empty. Irrational thoughts that the deceased person might reappear are common, and the bereaved person feels lost and alone. So when someone is in that type of emotional state, they really need to seek help from a therapist or a psychiatrist or a psychologist, because there are things that, you know, there are techniques and there are therapies, and they all don't have to be drugs. You know, it could be different therapies to get the person to accept what has happened and try to continue to live their life in a more positive way. So, you know, here, this is my normal, typical grief, how it's experienced in about a 13-month time period. So in the beginning with complicated grief, which is going to come on the blue line, it's exactly the same, right? However, as time goes on, you see within the blue, nothing really changes. It's the same, you know, it's the same sadness, the same, you know, nothing is getting better. And it just continues. The person just is the same way that they were just at the time they learned to grieve. And that's why it's complicated, because there are other things going on aside from the fact that the loved one is gone. And I'm going to explain some of those from a societal perspective. One of the reasons why this mother is grieving the way she is, because that's how she learned how to grieve. One of my favorite sayings is, the child is the father of the man. And what that means is how whatever the child was exposed to, or whatever he experienced or observed, that's how he or she relates, or that's how he or she believes how they are supposed to act as an adult, right? So especially if someone who they really respected or really loved act a certain way, they're emulating that person because that's what they learned. So maybe this person, you know, learned that, or they were taught that, you know, love never dies. Even though the person has died, you still hold a torch for that person, and you are still that person's spouse. Now, while that person might be living that life, he or she may be kind of mad because she is living that life, because that's the only way she knows how to be, right? So it's almost like, you know, you're doing something because you're supposed to do it, but you don't know why you are supposed to do it. So because you don't have the answer to the question of why you're doing what you're doing, you're getting frustrated and you're getting mad at everybody because you're doing this thing and you don't know why, and you're not happy about it. So that could be one reason. Again, I don't know. I'm not a therapist. I did not talk to this person's mother. But from a social point of view, that could be what is going on. The second thing is, perhaps that's how that mother identified themselves, right? So if you were married to, let's say, this lady, Miss Jones. Miss Jones was married to Mr. Jones for 40 years. She always identified herself as Mrs. Jones. Well, when Mr. Jones died, who is she? So, you know, that's a whole thing. Like, you know, there's no identification of the person is gone. Maybe the person's upset because the person died, her financial status is not the same. You know, there's all different things that are associated in a relationship, in a marriage, that is no longer there. And if that's no longer there, and that person has always identified themselves of having this money, this status, this name, this position, you know, that's another reason why that person could not get over is a bad word, could not move forward in their grief. Again, that's why it's complicated. There are so many different factors, aside from the fact that the person died, why this person cannot advance in their grief and get more, I said that wrong, why the person cannot go a normal or typical path of grief. And, you know, no one's, if you're in this situation, you're not left there, but it's really important to get some professional help, right? Because there are people, you know, a lot of us, especially in the Black community, we do not want to go and see psychiatrists. Let me tell you something. I go to counseling. Therapy is wonderful. The thing is that there are people who can help you if you are struggling with something. And, you know, sometimes, you know, that's another thing. Maybe this person feels this way, but the person doesn't want to go seek psychiatric help because she's afraid of what people think. You know, some of us are like that. We don't want to do certain things that are better for us because we don't want people to think we're crazy, which is kind of weird because people think we're crazy anyhow because we're not acting the way we should act. But anyhow, that's another thing for another time. So those are the two things. You know, what causes a person to experience complicated grief is that perhaps this is how that person was taught. This is what you do. And because she is doing what she thought she should do, she's miserable over it. And she's making everyone else's life miserable. And again, perhaps it's how she identified herself. She always identified herself as, I am Joe's wife. Well, Joe's not here anymore, so who are you now? So these are some resources on grief. Like I said, I gave you just a very, you know, very broad overview of complicated grief. But the Columbia Center for Complicated Grief, like I said, they have a whole building and they actually study this in to the very minute level. Also, the American Counseling Association, a good place to go because they have resources on grief and loss, and you could probably get a referral or something, not a referral, but get an idea of who in your area code or in your zip code is offering services. Grief.com is another great resource to find out about resources to get help if you think that you are grieving. There's nothing wrong to go into someone, especially an objective person, and say, you know what, I just need a, what's it called? Not a crazy tip. I just need a sanity check, right? Because this ain't going right and that ain't going right. And I just need someone who doesn't have a dog in the fight, you know, an objective person to let me know, you know, where am I missing the point? You know, and that person can also give you different therapies to try to live a more fulfilling life. So lastly, to recap, I did my disclosure. I ain't a therapist, I'm not a physician. I told you the situation. The situation was an individual explained to me that one parent has been dead for almost 10 years and the mother has not really recovered from it. And because she hasn't recovered, she has made life hell for everyone. And the person says, this is not, you know, by making life hell for everyone is not really honoring the memory of the father. And again, it goes back to maybe that's how she believes she is honoring the father. And maybe she's mad because everyone else has moved on with their life and she's the only one that's honoring. You know, again, it's complicated. And the only way you're gonna like figure this stuff out is if you go to a counselor, a therapist, and have that person figure out what's really going on. So I told you the situation. I gave you a definition of typical normal grief and how it looks. It looks very intense. In the beginning, it's intense and it happens a lot. And then eventually it kind of leads out and it's not as intense and it doesn't happen as much, but it does happen, you know, it does happen. Then I gave you a definition of complicated grief, with the illustration. The fact is that the grief is just as up and down as it was the first time the person learned about the death, and is almost a year later, right? And then I talked about what could cause an individual to experience complicated grief. Again, it's maybe how that person was taught, what they observed, what they experienced in their life, you know. And also the thing is, the other part was how we identify with certain things. So if someone had identified as Joe's wife and now Joe's not there, then the question is, well, who am I, right? And then I gave you guys some resources on grief. So that is about it. Let me see if there's anything else. A picture of me. So as you can see, I'm Dr. Lisa Oliver. You want to subscribe to Dr. Lisa Talks About. You want to go to my website, www.drlisaoliver.com, or email me, lisa@drlisaoliver.com. I'm about to start up my Death Cafe series. The first one is going to be March 7th, this Sunday coming up. And I'm also going to start on the third Sunday of every month. I'm going to do a pandemic grief cafe. You know, the Death Cafe, we really just talk about death, right? But in Grief Cafe, I think it's, well, I'm not saying I think, but you know, it's an opportunity for all of us just to share and talk about what is going on with us. Because what's going on with grief these days is that this pandemic has really taken everything from us, even how we used to grieve, right? And just let me go off on a tangent for a second. If you think about it, you know, when a person died, we would go to a funeral, we would all get together, we would have a big service, we would meet, we would talk, we would laugh, we would fellowship. And with the pandemic, we can't do that anymore. So that's a grief on top of the grief of losing the person. So I just wanted to give everyone space for 2 hours so we can share, so we can, you know, commiserate, and maybe some healing will come along. So that's it for now. I am Dr. Lisa Oliver. Thank you so much for giving me some time, and talk to y'all soon. Bye-bye.